The New Norm is brought to you by Winning at Home. I'm Steve Norman. Welcome to The New Norm. There's a great line in Matthew chapter 9 that says, Jesus went through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and sickness. And when he saw the crowds, he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. That's a great line. And that line, sheep without a shepherd, that phrase actually appears twice in the Old Testament. In fact, when Moses is getting ready to pass away, and he knows he's got to hand over the leadership of the entire people of Israel to a successor, and that person hasn't been identified yet, he's nervous. And so he prays this prayer. He says, "May the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in, so the Lord's people will not be like a sheep without a shepherd." And the Lord said to Moses, "Take Joshua, son of Nun, a man in whom is the spirit of leadership, and lay your hand on him." So Moses is saying, "Lord, I've tried to lead these people faithfully for 40 years. Do not abandon them to a life of wandering without a strong leader." And God answers that prayer in the person of Joshua. And then we read later in 1 Kings chapter 22, when some kings of Israel are getting ready to go off to an ill-advised war. And a prophet, Micaiah, said this, "I saw all of Israel scattered on the hills like sheep without a shepherd. And the Lord said, these people have no master. They have no leader. They have nobody who's committed to their best interests and their well-being." He says, "Let each one go home in peace." So there were a time when God's people had no shepherd, and that was dangerous and disorienting. And there were other seasons where they had bad shepherds. And bad shepherds are as dangerous, if not more dangerous, than no shepherds, because they scatter the sheep. And again, they put them in harm's way. And God has no tolerance for selfish shepherds. Listen to what he says in Ezekiel chapter 34. "The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you shepherds of Israel who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with the wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock." Ezekiel's saying, you're using all of these people for your own benefit, for your own greed, for your own selfishness. You're not doing anything that advances their health, their growth, or their well-being. Verse 4, "You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally." So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over the mountains, and on every high hill they were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Kind of contrast that with what you hear in Luke chapter 15, where Jesus says, the good shepherd, if even one out of a flock of 100 is missing, leaves everything else on pause and doesn't rest until that sheep has been brought home. And he's saying this instance, the people who are supposedly leading Israel spiritually in this era of their story aren't anywhere close to reflecting the heart of a good or healthy shepherd. Verse 7, "Therefore you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, because my flock lacks a shepherd and so has been plundered and has become food for all the wild animals, and because my shepherds did not search for my flock but cared for themselves rather than for my flock. Therefore you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against the shepherds and will hold them accountable for my flock. I will remove them from tending the flock so that the shepherds can no longer feed themselves. I will rescue my flock from their mouths, and it will no longer be food for them." God says, I'm going to deal with the shepherds. I'm going to hold them accountable for the wrong that they've done and the harm that they've caused. Now, I want to be clear. Most people that I know who enter ministry do not do it to fleece flocks or take advantage of them economically, emotionally, or spiritually. Most people who go into it well-intentioned. But there's something that can happen over time. And a lot of times, the people who are most at risk of turning into bad shepherds are people who are immensely talented, people who have churches who grow really quickly and have crowds kind of materialize overnight and have hundreds of thousands or if not millions of dollars pouring into that church every year that they did not anticipate. And once they get a taste of that influence or the power or the leverage or the resources, it can be really easy for them to just ever so slightly devolve into somebody who's only and ultimately about themselves. Like, I don't think anybody rolls out of bed one day and says, you know what, I'm going to take advantage of everybody who's under my spiritual care. But I think it's like a kind of a frog in the kettle type moment. I think there's this rising boil where if pastors do not have people who love them enough to tell them the truth or care about them enough to hold them accountable, according to Ezekiel 34, there will be a moment where if nobody else intervenes, God will, to hold reckless and dangerous and abusive shepherds accountable for the wrong that they are doing. So God says, first, I'm going to hold all of those shepherds accountable, and then I'm going to rescue my flock. Verse 11, for this is what the sovereign Lord says, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them. As a shepherd looks after his scattered flock when he is with them, so I will look after my sheep. I will rescue them from all of the places they were scattered on a day of clouds and darkness. And then later in the passage, he says, I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will judge between one sheep and another. I will place over them one shepherd, my servant David. Now, he's not speaking literally, he's speaking metaphorically, because the actual King David has been dead for a long time when this passage is written. So he goes, I'm going to place a person in the spirit or in the likeness of David over them, and he will tend them. He will tend them and be their shepherd. I, the Lord, will be their God, and my servant David will be prince among them. I, the Lord, have spoken. I will make a covenant of peace with them and rid the land of the savage beasts so that they may live in the wilderness and sleep in the forests in safety. And then closer to the end of the passage, God says this, you are my sheep, the sheep of my pasture, and I am your God, declares the sovereign Lord. And I love this. If you're at a season of your life where you might not go to a local church body for worship on a regular basis because you have been disappointed, disgruntled, or disillusioned by bad shepherds, know this. God is calling out to you again. And God is saying what that person or what those group of people did was wrong. And even though they pretended to act in my name, they did not reflect my will, my desire, or my character. And know this, I am your God. You are my sheep, and I will shepherd you well. And I think that if we're not careful, we can kind of spin into this cycle of cynicism or frustration or anger or bitterness that pulls us out of the orbit of the pasture of God altogether, because of our, in some cases, very legitimate frustration and rage with bad shepherds. But Jesus offers us this promise in John chapter 10, verse 10. I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. This is the anti-bad shepherd in Ezekiel, who all he did was fleece the sheep for his own convenience. And Jesus says, I'm going to flip that model on its head, and I'm going to lay down my life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. And then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. And if you have been under toxic or abusive or harmful spiritual leaders who cared nothing for you and only for their own status or power or influence, know this. Jesus says to you afresh, I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. There's a reason that a lot of people won't quote their favorite verses from Ezekiel. There are some hard truths baked into it. And I know that as a pastor, sometimes I love to proclaim words of correction or rebuke or repentance to people who were outside of my tribe, because it's always easier to call other people out for their sins that are not like your sins. But I find it fascinating that in the book of Ezekiel, as much as God is rebuking pagans, people who are not following the God of Israel, he has as harsh a message for people who claim to be followers of the one true God and are failing to represent him well. So the cold reality is that just as there was in Ezekiel's day, there are some bad shepherds running loose these days. And unfortunately, some of you have had a front row seat to their neglect or their abuse. But the good news that we have, the promise that we have in both Ezekiel and the Gospel of John, is that God is not only going to call twisted shepherds to account, but he is going to rescue his sheep. He's going to bring them back to safety. He's going to bind up their wounds until they are healed, because that's what the heart of the Good Shepherd looks like. The New Norm is produced and distributed by Winning at Home. Winning at Home is a faith-based nonprofit committed to making individuals, couples, and families stronger through counseling and coaching. For more information, visit winningathome.com. I'm your host, Steve Norman. Thanks for listening.